Picture this. London, England, 1877. A crowded courtroom. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, pencils poised. Outside, hundreds more pressed against the windows trying to hear. Inside, a man in his mid-30s stood in the dock, shoulders back, eyes calm. He had been charged with practicing medicine without a license, with fraud, with endangering the public. The judge read the charges slowly, pausing between each one for effect. The man in the dock didn't flinch. He had been dragged before magistrates before. He had been expelled from a country before. He had watched his closest friend die in his arms before. None of it had stopped him. The prosecutor leaned forward and asked the courtroom a question that everyone wanted answered. "Who," he said, "does this man think he is?" His name was Thomas John Barnardo. He was the son of a furrier from Dublin who had no medical degree, no family wealth, no powerful friends, and no business starting anything at all. But by the time that courtroom scene unfolded, he had already pulled more than 1,000 children off the streets of East London and given them a place to sleep, food to eat, and a reason to believe their lives were worth something, and he was just getting started. This is not a story about a perfect man. Barnardo made mistakes. He cut corners. He exaggerated. He was stubborn to the point of madness and driven in a way that made him difficult to live with. But in 40 years of ministry, he housed over 60,000 destitute children, opened 96 homes across the United Kingdom, and built an empire of mercy from nothing but prayer, persistence, and an absolute refusal to turn a child away. His story proves something the world keeps trying to argue against. God doesn't need your credentials, He just needs your yes. Thomas John Barnardo was born July 4, 1845, in Dublin, Ireland. His father, John Michaelis Barnardo, was a prosperous furrier, respectable, careful, German by descent and proud of it. His mother, Abigail, was a gentle woman who read scripture to her children every morning before breakfast. Thomas was the fourth of 6 children, and from the very beginning, he was the difficult one. Quick-tempered, easily bored, full of opinions he hadn't yet earned. At school, he fought with boys twice his size. At home, he argued with teachers and preachers alike. His father once said that Thomas was either going to change the world or drive everyone in it to exhaustion, and he wasn't sure which. At 16, Thomas wasn't religious at all. He was a dandy. He spent money he didn't have on fashionable clothes, stayed out late, read novels his mother wouldn't have approved of. He was the kind of young man who is charming at a party and impossible to pin down afterward. He had a sharp mind and used it mainly for argument. Then, in the spring of 1862, a Plymouth Brethren revival came to Dublin. Thomas went because a girl he admired was going. He sat in the back, arms folded, fully prepared to be unimpressed. The preacher that evening wasn't particularly eloquent, but something happened in that room that Thomas would spend the rest of his life trying to explain and never quite managing to. He felt, he later wrote, as if the top of his skull had been lifted off and light had poured in. He went home that night and didn't sleep. By morning, he was a different person. His family noticed immediately. The clothes stopped. The late nights stopped. He began spending hours reading scripture with an intensity that startled his mother, who had prayed for this, but hadn't quite expected it to arrive so suddenly or so completely. Within a year, he had a new plan. He wanted to be a missionary to China. The Middle Kingdom was on the hearts of many young evangelicals in the 1860s. Hudson Taylor had recently returned from his first journey and was speaking everywhere about the desperate spiritual need. Thomas read everything he could find about China. He began studying Mandarin. He wrote in his diary, "I will go if God opens the door. I will go even if He doesn't open it very wide." To prepare, he applied to study medicine in London. In October 1866, 21 years old and carrying everything he owned in a single bag, he arrived in the East End of London, and the East End of London broke him open. Nothing in Dublin had prepared him for this. East London in 1866 was a different world from the respectable streets of his childhood. Entire families lived in rooms the size of a wardrobe. Children slept in doorways wearing newspapers for warmth. 7-year-olds worked 12-hour days in match factories. The smell of poverty was physical. It got into your clothes, your hair, your sleep. Thomas walked those streets at night, unable to stop. He would find boys huddled under bridges, girls selling flowers in the cold rain, infants left in doorways while their mothers went to work or went to drink. He began giving away everything in his pockets, then going home and coming back with bread, then staying until sunrise just to make sure no one froze. One night in the winter of 1866, Thomas was teaching a class for ragged children at a local mission when a thin boy sat down in the back row. His name, Thomas learned, was Jim Jarvis. He was 11 years old. At the end of the lesson, every other child filed out into the night. Jim stayed. "Haven't you got a home?" Thomas asked. "No, sir," Jim said. "Haven't you got a mother?" "She's dead, sir, a father." He went off. Thomas took Jim home that night. In the morning, Jim offered to show Thomas where the other boys slept. He took him to a rooftop in Whitechapel, where 11 boys lay sleeping in the cold under strips of canvas. They were between 7 and 14 years old. None of them had anywhere else to go. Thomas stood on that rooftop for a long time without speaking. When he came back down, China was gone. He had found his mission field. It was right here. He opened his first home for destitute boys in 1867 on Hope Place in Stepney. He was 22 years old. He had no money, no institutional backing, no experience running anything. The house was a rented property he couldn't quite afford, furnished with donations he had personally collected by going door to door in wealthier neighborhoods and refusing to leave until someone gave him something. He started with 25 boys. Within a year, there were nearly 100. He made one rule that would define everything that came after. No child who came to the door would ever be turned away. Not at midnight. Not when the beds were full. Not when the money had run out. He would put children on the floor if he had to. He would sleep on the floor himself. But no child would ever stand at his gate and be told there was no room. He called it his ever-open door, and it cost him constantly. In the early years, there were nights when Thomas genuinely didn't know how he was going to feed the children under his roof the next morning. He would kneel in his office after midnight and pray with a specificity that surprised even him. "Lord, we need 7 pounds by Thursday or we cannot buy flour." And he would tell no one but God, and the money would come, not always dramatically. Sometimes in a letter slipped under the door, sometimes in a donation from a businessman who had heard about the home secondhand. Once, a woman he had never met left him exactly the amount he needed in an envelope, addressed simply, "For the children." He began writing about these moments in a newsletter he sent to supporters, which he called Night and Day, and people across Britain began reading it and sending what they could. But it was never enough. It was never quite enough, because Thomas kept expanding. Every time he solved one problem, he found 10 more children who needed help. In 1870, he opened a home for girls. In 1873, he opened a home for the disabled. In 1876, he opened an industrial training farm, believing that charity without a future was not enough, that children needed skills, not just shelter. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, he fell in love. Ciri Louise Elmsley was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, and the most practical woman Thomas had ever met. She was quiet where he was loud, methodical where he was impulsive, and she had a gift for organizing that Thomas desperately needed. They met in 1871. He was 25. She was 23. He proposed 8 months later. Her father was not enthusiastic. Thomas had no income to speak of, no settled institution, no guarantee of anything. He lived in a rented room above one of his own charity homes, and his personal finances were indistinguishable from the organization's. Ciri's father told her plainly that she was choosing a hard life. Ciri told him she knew. They were married in June 1873. She moved into the mission without complaint and spent the rest of her life making it work. They had 11 children together. They would bury 3 of them. A daughter, their youngest girl, died of scarlet fever at 2 years old. A son died at birth. Another son made it to 4 before pneumonia took him. Thomas buried each one and went back to work because there was no alternative to going back to work. The children in the homes needed him. He wept in private. He preached in public. He kept moving. But the grief changed him. People who knew Thomas before and after the loss of his children said he became softer in some ways and more relentless in others. He began spending even more hours in prayer. He became less interested in winning arguments and more interested in results. He also became, some said, less careful. This is where the story gets complicated, because Thomas Barnardo was not a saint in the way we like our heroes to be. He was brilliant and he was flawed, and sometimes the two were indistinguishable. He began photographing the children who came to his homes, which was, in itself, a genuinely innovative practice. He wanted donors to understand the reality of what he was rescuing children from. So he would photograph a child when they arrived, ragged and thin and frightened, and then photograph them again months later, clean and healthy and fed. He sent these photographs to supporters. People responded. Donations increased. Lives continued to be saved. But Thomas made a decision that would haunt him. He began staging some of the photographs. He would dress children up in rags even if they hadn't arrived that way, to make the contrast more striking. He called it artistic fiction in defense of a larger truth. His critics called it lying. In the technical sense, they were right. When this was exposed, the response was devastating. Accusations of fraud. A formal arbitration case in 1877, the courtroom scene that opened this story. Thomas sat in that dock and listened to 2 years' worth of grievances aired in public. Some of the charges were legitimate. Some were exaggerated by enemies who wanted him destroyed. The tribunal ultimately ruled in his favor on the most serious charges, but found him guilty of the deception in the photographs and rebuked him publicly. He left that courtroom shaken. He never fully recovered his reputation in certain circles. He never quite lost it in others. He went home, knelt down, and asked God what to do next. He kept going, because the children were still there. And here is what most people don't know about Thomas Barnardo. The public controversy nearly broke him. But what broke him further, and more quietly, was something that happened before any of the courtroom drama. It was a single child, a boy named John Summers, who went by the name Carrots because of his red hair. Carrots had come to the Stepney home one night and knocked on the door. It was late. The home was full. One of Thomas's staff, following a policy Thomas had reluctantly allowed to creep into practice when the overcrowding became unmanageable, turned the boy away. 3 days later, they found Carrots dead in a haybox in a courtyard nearby. He had frozen. When Thomas heard, he went to the room where the boy had been turned away and stood there for a very long time alone. He had let a rule become more important than a child. He had let administration creep into the space where mercy belonged. He went back and made the ever-open door an unbreakable rule, not just a slogan, with no exceptions and no override authority. From that day forward, no member of his staff had the power to turn a child away under any circumstances. If the home was full, they would find space. If there was no money, they would pray. But no child would be turned away. He put a sign on the door. It stayed there until the day he died. The 1880s and 1890s brought scale that Thomas had never imagined when he first climbed that Whitechapel rooftop. Homes opened in Bristol, Edinburgh, Belfast, Cardiff. A program began for emigrating children to Canada, where thousands of boys and girls were placed with farming families in Ontario and the Maritimes, given land and work and a fresh start far from the East End. Not all of those placements were good ones. Some children ended up in situations that were hard and loveless, and later drew legitimate criticism. Thomas knew some of this. He responded by increasing oversight, by sending inspectors, by creating systems for children to report mistreatment. He didn't always respond fast enough. This too is part of the record, but the scale of mercy being accomplished was equally real. 60,000 children over 40 years. That is not a rounding error. That is not an abstraction. Those are 60,000 individuals who had someone stand between them and the street. Thomas kept a photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. It was not one of the staged ones. It was a photograph of Jim Jarvis, the 11-year-old boy who had stayed behind in the mission hall and taken him to that rooftop in Whitechapel on a winter night in 1866. Thomas had watched Jim grow up, seen him become a man with a job and a family, and a life he would never have had otherwise. He kept Jim's photograph there to remember why he started. On the days when the administration was crushing him, and the donors were angry, and the press were running another attack, he would look at that photograph and remember the rooftop. He would remember 11 boys lying under canvas in the cold. He would remember that none of them had asked for much. They had just needed someone to notice. Thomas's health began failing in the late 1890s. He had never taken care of himself. He ate poorly, slept little, spent the hours other men used for rest on correspondence and prayer, and walking through the homes after midnight to check on the children who couldn't sleep. By 1901, he was seriously ill. His heart was weakening. His doctors told him to slow down. He ignored them with the cheerful stubbornness that had defined his entire career. Siri watched him with worry that she couldn't always hide, and love that she never once wavered in. She had shared 40 years of this life, this exhausting, glorious, chaotic, prayerful, imperfect life. She had buried their children beside him. She had sat up with him when the money ran out and prayed beside him when it inexplicably arrived. She had read every night and day newsletter before it went to press. She had been the one stable architecture in a building that was always expanding faster than it should. In the final years, Thomas began to write more reflectively. He wrote about the rooftops. He wrote about carrots, and what that loss had cost him, and what it had taught him. He wrote about what he believed the secret of the work actually was. And it wasn't the fundraising. And it wasn't the photography campaigns. And it wasn't the organizational structure. He wrote, "I have spent more time on my knees in this work than at my desk. And when I have reversed that order, the work has always suffered for it." He had learned painfully that the secret place was not optional. It was not the devotional warm-up before the real work began. It was the real work. Everything else flowed from that, or it didn't flow at all. In September 1905, Thomas John Barnardo died at his home in Surbiton, Surrey. He was 60 years old. He had worn himself out completely in the work, and if you had asked him whether he regretted it, he would have looked at you as if the question made no sense. He left behind 96 homes, over 8,500 children currently in care, and a system that would go on serving children for more than a century after his death. The organization that bears his name still exists today. It is the largest children's charity in the United Kingdom. In 2024, it reached over 350,000 children and families. But none of that is the reason his story matters. His story matters because of what he did on the night he stood on that Whitechapel rooftop. He had gone there at the invitation of a ragged 11-year-old boy who wanted to show him something. He had expected to be moved. He had not expected to be completely redirected. He stood in the cold, looking at 11 sleeping children, and asked God what to do. And then he went and did it. Without a plan, without money, without anything except the absolute certainty that he was supposed to. That is not strategy. That is not programming. That is a man who has spent enough time in prayer to recognize the voice when it comes, and who has practiced obedience enough to move when it speaks. There were 100 reasons he should have failed. He had no credentials. He had a documented public scandal. He buried 3 of his own children. He was dragged into court. He made decisions that were wrong, and decisions that were right, and sometimes couldn't tell the difference until years later. He was not the hero of his own story in the way we like our heroes to be. He was just available. That was the whole thing. He was available. When the rooftop appeared, he stayed. When the door needed to stay open, he kept it open. When the money ran out, he prayed and waited and did not close the homes. When his health failed, he kept going until he couldn't. When the critics came, he listened to what was legitimate, changed what he could, and kept moving. You might be reading this in a moment of your own doubt, a moment when the thing you feel called to seems too large and you seem too small, when the resources don't match the vision and the opposition feels more organized than the support, when you've made mistakes you can't undo and you're wondering if they disqualify you from what comes next. Thomas Barnardo was dragged into a public courtroom. He had staged photographs and been caught doing it. He had let a rule override a child, and a child had died. He was imperfect in documented ways, not theoretical ones. And God used him anyway, not despite the imperfection, but through a man who brought the imperfection to his knees regularly, who prayed over the mistakes, who kept the door open even when he wanted to close it, and who never, not once in 40 years, let the organization become more important than the child standing at the gate. What is standing at your gate right now? If you're ready to say yes, regardless of what you have or don't have, comment below. And for more stories of ordinary men and women whose availability changed the world, subscribe to Circle of Voices and hit the notification bell, because the next story we're bringing you is one that will shake you to your core. A young woman raised on the Canadian prairies, told she was too quiet, too plain, too ordinary for anything extraordinary, who walked alone into one of the most hostile places on earth and became a legend. You will not want to miss it.